In the last hours of 2024, Paris was doing what Paris always does when the year is about to die, polishing its windows, arranging its chandeliers, rehearsing the illusion that time can be persuaded. Somewhere behind heavy doors, in a palace suite, a woman who had once been discussed like a financial instrument and photographed like a scandal lay down for a nap before the celebrations. She would not wake. By the time the calendars turned, the only certainty left was the bluntness of the record Jocelyn Wildenstein, Swiss-born socialite, dead in Paris on the 31st of December 2024. The city outside did not slow down for the headline. It rarely does. But the headline had been waiting for her for decades because she had lived as a contradiction so vivid it became a kind of public entertainment, a life that began in ordinary European anonymity and ended as a global shorthand for money, reinvention, and the violence of being seen. The photographs always arrived first before the facts could catch up. They were never kind, never neutral, never allowed to be simply documentary. A face in high resolution lit by flashbulbs that turned skin into rumor. Cheekbones that looked engineered. Eyes that seemed pulled toward the edges of their sockets, as if the expression had been tightened like a knot and left there for years. Hair lacquered into place, jewelry sitting on the collarbone with the cold assurance of money that expects to be obeyed. In those images, she is usually mid-step, half-turned, as though the world had called her name and she had no choice but to acknowledge it. Around her, everything signals the vocabulary of wealth: hotel lobbies, glossy black cars, the soft blur of velvet ropes and couture, and yet the mood is never triumph. It is exposure. It is a body carrying the cost of being looked at for too long by too many strangers with too much appetite. The nickname that followed her, the one the tabloids preferred because it was easy to sell and impossible to escape, reduced a complicated human life to a punchline Catwoman. It sounded playful, even comic, until you understood what it did. It took a woman and turned her into a mask, a spectacle, an object lesson the world could point at, without ever admitting what it wanted from her. And then, there is the other set of numbers, the ones that never needed a camera. A marriage into a dynasty of art and power. A divorce that detonated across New York society and into international news. A settlement reported at $2.5 billion, followed by $100 million a year for 13 years, sums so large they stop, meaning anything except that someone somewhere had once believed she was worth paying almost any price to remove. There was even a judicial stipulation widely repeated because it carried the faintly grotesque neatness of irony. The money could not be used for more cosmetic surgery. It read like a moral footnote attached to a financial transaction, an attempt to legislate the body after the marriage had already failed. For a moment, the story appeared to settle into the kind of ending modern culture loves: exile, with gold humiliation cushioned by money, the world's laughter drowned out by private jets and penthouses. But time does not respect settlements. By 2018, she filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. In the paperwork, the legend thinned into something stark: debts in the millions, assets and claims under dispute, and a checking account balance reported as zero. Billions then broke. The kind of reversal that sounds impossible until it happens in plain legal language. In the public imagination, her face and her finances fused into a single cautionary image, as if money itself had sculpted her and then abandoned the work unfinished. But the reality was uglier and more banal, which is often how power collapses, not with a clean cinematic drop, but with a slow hemorrhage of control. A life spent inside rooms where everything can be purchased, yet nothing essential can be kept. A life in which admiration is rarely love, and access is rarely safety. The cameras kept coming anyway because the world does not release its symbols easily. Even the fights became content arrests, charges, headlines that reduced private volatility to a few brutal verbs. The relationship that accompanied her for years, the designer fiancé who spoke for her at the end, was itself a mix of glamour and turbulence, intimacy and public record. And then, in a Paris suite, where the year was supposed to end in champagne, it ended in stillness instead. Reports described a pulmonary embolism, a blockage that arrives silently and settles everything without drama. It was almost too ordinary for a life that had been made so extraordinary by other people's obsession. She died not on a red carpet, not under lights, but in sleep, as if the body finally insisted on privacy when the world had refused to grant it. Stories like this are never really about one woman, no matter how singular the face becomes or how extreme the numbers appear. They survive because they fit into a pattern that modern society understands instinctively but prefers not to examine too closely: the spectacle of a woman who enters the highest rooms of power and is then slowly converted into a symbol, a warning, or a joke. Jocelyn Wildenstein's life matters not because it was unique, but because it was legible. It unfolded in a world that knows exactly how to reward beauty, youth, and adaptability, and just as precisely how to punish them once they stop behaving on command. Her name did not endure because of her philanthropy, her taste, or her intelligence, though all three existed in complex forms. It endured because her body became the visible ledger on which desire, money, and control were publicly balanced and recalculated over decades. In that sense, her story belongs to a much older lineage of women whose proximity to power granted them visibility but not authorship, abundance but not security. At the center of this lineage is a contradiction that never fully resolves. Power promises agency, yet often arrives through attachment. Wealth suggests freedom, yet frequently requires compliance. For women who enter elite systems through marriage, beauty, or strategic intimacy, the ascent is rarely framed as conquest. It is framed as alignment. The language is softer, the violence quieter. Opportunity appears as romance, protection, or destiny. And once inside, the rules are enforced not through force, but through expectation. Jocelyn Wildenstein was not born into the financial architecture that would later define her public identity. She entered it through a relationship that fused affection with hierarchy, desire with surveillance. Her life forces an uncomfortable question into view when power is granted conditionally. What happens to the self that must keep earning its right to exist? The public fascination with her appearance, so often framed as grotesque curiosity, functioned as a distraction from this deeper issue. Fixating on the face allowed society to avoid confronting the system that made such transformation intelligible, even logical. Cosmetic surgery did not emerge in her life as a sudden act of madness, but as a continuation of a long negotiation between value and visibility. In elite social ecosystems, the body is never neutral. It is currency, signal, armor, and liability at once. The more capital surrounds a woman, the more her body is expected to justify its presence. Youth must be maintained. Desire must be curated. Individuality must never interfere with the image demanded by the environment. Jocelyn Wildenstein did not invent this economy. She simply lived too long inside it, long enough for the costs to become impossible to hide. This is why her story repeats itself across eras, cultures, and social classes, even when the details change. The names differ, the fashions evolve, the numbers grow larger, but the mechanism remains familiar. A woman enters power through proximity rather than conquest. She adapts herself to remain indispensable. She is praised for her transformation until the transformation becomes unsettling. At that point, admiration curdles into fascination, fascination into mockery. The system that once rewarded her distanced itself from the outcome, presenting her downfall as personal failure rather than structural inevitability. Jocelyn Wildenstein's life sits squarely within this cycle, yet it also exposes its cruelty with unusual clarity, because everything happened in public under financial disclosures, police reports, court transcripts, and relentless photography. The central question this story asks is therefore not about vanity, excess, or self-destruction, though all three appear on the surface. It is about authorship. Who controls the narrative of a woman's transformation once she enters a world that profits from reshaping her? At what point does adaptation become erasure? And how does a person distinguish between choice and survival when the environment rewards one version of the self and punishes all others? Jocelyn Wildenstein's life does not offer answers. It offers a case study in what happens when identity is slowly externalized, when reflection replaces interiority, and when power is experienced not as freedom, but as constant negotiation. Her story matters because it forces a reckoning with the cost of visibility in a world that confuses being seen with being known, and wealth with control. Jocelyn Paraset was born in Lausanne, Switzerland, in 1940, into a world far removed from the dynastic wealth that would later define her public identity. Her early life was marked not by excess but by a subtle absence of stability. Her parents separated when she was young, leaving her to grow up primarily with her mother, a dynamic that quietly shaped her understanding of attachment and impermanence. Switzerland, in the post-war years, offered order, neutrality, and restraint. Yet, within this controlled environment, emotional distance was common currency. Affection was rarely demonstrative. Expectations were implicit rather than spoken. Jocelyn learned early that security was not guaranteed by proximity alone, and that adaptation was often the price of belonging. This formative instability did not produce visible rebellion or collapse. Instead, it cultivated attentiveness, a sensitivity to shifts in mood, power, and approval that would later become a survival skill. As an adolescent and young adult, she gravitated toward environments that promised movement rather than roots. Travel, relationships, and opportunity functioned as escape routes from emotional stasis. She was observant, socially agile, and acutely aware of how presence could be leveraged. Beauty, while never aggressively cultivated in her youth, became an asset she understood intuitively, not as vanity, but as access. In a world where women's agency was often mediated through desirability, Jocelyn learned to read the room quickly and adjust herself accordingly. This was not self-erasure but self-modulation, a trait reinforced by environments that rewarded compliance with advancement. What did not develop during these years was a stable internal anchor independent of external validation. Identity remained flexible, responsive, unfinished. The seeds of future tragedy lay not in trauma alone, but in this early conditioning, the belief that safety was relational contingent and always negotiable. Jocelyn's entry into elite circles was neither accidental nor abrupt. Before Alec Wildenstein, she moved through relationships that gradually introduced her to wealth, leisure, and influence, including a romantic involvement with a French filmmaker that expanded her cultural exposure and social reach. These experiences functioned as an informal education, teaching her how power behaved when unchallenged, how men accustomed to authority expected loyalty, and how women in proximity to that authority were valued for discretion as much as charm. By the time she met Alec Wildenstein in the mid-1970s, she was already fluent in the unspoken codes of privilege. Their meeting, reportedly during a safari in Kenya, unfolded in a setting that symbolized conquest, ownership, and control over nature itself. It was an environment where power felt elemental, unquestioned, and absolute, and Jocelyn stepped into it without hesitation. Marriage to Alec Wildenstein formalized her transformation. She entered a world governed by legacy rather than novelty, where decisions were shaped by inheritance, secrecy, and long memory. The Wildenstein family operated as custodians of cultural capital, dealing in art not merely as objects of beauty but as instruments of influence and wealth preservation. Within this structure, Jocelyn's role was clear. She was to embody continuity, elegance, and discretion. Education continued informally through proximity rather than instruction. She learned by observing how silence functioned as authority, how visibility was managed rather than embraced, and how power resided less in action than in the ability to withhold it. Sacrifice arrived disguised as privilege. Autonomy narrowed as responsibility expanded, yet each concession felt justified by the rewards that accompanied it. The woman who emerged from this process was polished, disciplined, and strategically adaptable, but increasingly distant from the self that existed before power required maintenance. Jocelyn Wildenstein's true ascent did not occur the moment she married into extraordinary wealth. It began when she learned how that wealth functioned as a language. The marriage to Alec Wildenstein in 1978 placed her inside a dynasty that did not merely possess money, but used it as a form of quiet governance. The Wildenstein name carried authority in art, real estate, and high society across Europe and the United States, a lineage built not on visibility but on discretion acquisitions, negotiated behind closed doors, and a belief that influence worked best when it did not announce itself. Jocelyn adapted quickly. She moved between continents, residences, and social circles with a precision that suggested discipline rather than indulgence. Private jets, ranches, Manhattan apartments, Kenyan safaris, and elite gatherings became routine, not spectacle. In public, she was presented as the elegant Swiss wife of a powerful art dealer. In private, she learned the architecture of elite life where loyalty mattered more than affection and image more than explanation. Her days were structured by access, and access by proximity to her husband's world. Wealth at this level did not intoxicate through excess, but through insulation. Problems were handled by intermediaries. Silence was a strategy. Emotional distance was normal, even necessary. As her position solidified, Jocelyn's identity became increasingly entwined with representation. She was not expected to generate wealth only to embody it correctly. This role came with rewards that felt limitless visibility, without accountability, admiration, without familiarity, and the intoxicating sense of being untouchable. The social world responded accordingly. She was photographed, discussed, and envied. Doors opened without questions. Her presence carried the authority of the Wildenstein fortune, and with it, the unspoken understanding that consequences were negotiable. Yet the environment that elevated her also demanded constant calibration. Appearance, demeanor, and discretion were not personal expressions but professional obligations. Power arrived wrapped in luxury, but it was conditional, maintained through alignment rather than autonomy. The more she succeeded in inhabiting this world, the more distant her inner life became from public perception. Silence grew where intimacy should have lived. What appeared from the outside as triumph was internally a narrowing corridor where the range of acceptable selves diminished year by year. Over time, adaptation began to feel like mastery. Jocelyn Wildenstein learned how to manage spaces, staff schedules, and expectations with efficiency. She learned how to command attention without appearing to ask for it, how to deploy generosity strategically, how to disappear when scrutiny threatened to turn invasive. Within the marriage, she exercised authority over domestic domains, philanthropy, and presentation areas that allowed her to feel decisive without challenging the hierarchy that ultimately defined her position. This sense of control extended to her body, which existed within an elite culture that treated physical modification not as deviation but as refinement. Change was normalized, even encouraged, as long as it served continuity. Each adjustment could be rationalized as maintenance improvement or preservation. The mirror became less a reflection than a project, something to be managed like any other asset. Control, however, was increasingly performative. Decisions appeared deliberate, but the range of possible choices had already been circumscribed by the system she inhabited. The warning signs were present, though they did not announce themselves as danger. Emotional detachment was praised as composure. Isolation was reframed as privacy. Excessive intervention was described as taste. Even conflict, when it emerged, was softened by money's ability to delay consequences. The marriage itself began to fracture under the weight of parallel lives, yet the structure surrounding it absorbed tension without immediate collapse. Jocelyn's confidence grew in proportion to the belief that nothing was irreversible, that wealth could correct any imbalance, including the erosion of trust. This belief hardened into assumption. When power functions as a buffer for too long, it becomes indistinguishable from invulnerability. The illusion of control did not fail suddenly. It thickened, insulating her from feedback, convincing her that adaptation was agency and that survival was synonymous with dominance. By the time the system began to withdraw its protection, the habits formed under its shelter were already too entrenched to abandon. The flaw that ultimately sealed Jocelyn Wildenstein's fate was not vanity in the crude sense the public preferred to believe, but a deeper, quieter obsession, the need to remain indispensable inside a system that only valued her, conditionally. Control once tasted became inseparable from survival. She had learned early that alignment preserved access, and access preserved existence. When the marriage began to disintegrate, this logic did not dissolve, it intensified. Rather than recalibrating her identity outside the structure that had defined her, she doubled down on the one form of agency still available to her, the management of image, loyalty, and presence. Every adjustment, physical or emotional, followed the same internal reasoning: remain necessary, remain chosen, remain inside. What could not be controlled was ignored. What threatened stability was treated as temporary noise. The breaking point was not a single event, but a convergence. The discovery of her husband's infidelity, the unraveling of trust, and the realization that power could be withdrawn as abruptly as it had been granted, shattered the illusion that adaptation guaranteed security. The divorce proceedings exposed a truth that had been carefully avoided for years. Her authority existed only within the marriage, and once that bond dissolved, the system reasserted its hierarchy without hesitation. The court's involvement in her finances and body formalized what had always been implicit, that even her autonomy had limits imposed by others. From this moment forward, decisions became reactive rather than strategic. The obsession with control, once a tool for survival, hardened into rigidity. Patterns that had once allowed her to navigate elite life now trapped her inside it, unable to imagine a self not defined by opposition, visibility, or defense. The turn was irreversible, not because of one choice, but because the internal framework guiding those choices could no longer produce a viable future. After the divorce, the insulation that wealth once provided began to thin. Though the settlement was vast, it came with scrutiny, limitations, and an unspoken expiration date. The world that had once buffered her from consequence now observed her with a different posture, no longer deferential but evaluative. Financial disputes emerged. Legal filings replaced social invitations. The silence that once protected her turned into absence. Over time, the fortune that had symbolized permanence revealed its fragility. Expenses accumulated, investments faltered, and by 2018, the public record documented what had once seemed unthinkable bankruptcy. The numbers told a stark story of misalignment between lifestyle and liquidity, but the deeper collapse was psychological. Power no longer translated into authority. Visibility no longer commanded respect. The mechanisms that once responded to her presence now responded only to paperwork. Personal relationships fractured under pressure. Volatility that had been absorbed quietly during years of privilege now surfaced publicly, resulting in arrests, charges, and headlines that further eroded her control over narrative. Each incident reinforced the same pattern: power did not disappear all at once. It withdrew incrementally, leaving behind exposure without protection. The face that had been endlessly photographed became a site of ridicule rather than fascination, its complexity flattened into caricature. Isolation deepened, trust narrowed. The world that had once felt curated began to feel hostile, even predatory. What remained constant was attention, but attention without influence is a form of confinement. As resources dwindled and reputational capital evaporated, Jocelyn Wildenstein found herself trapped inside the very image that had once secured her place. Collapse arrived, not as spectacle but as attrition, the slow realization that nothing she once controlled still answered to her. In her final years, Jocelyn Wildenstein lived far from the authority that had once defined her existence. Though she remained recognizable, recognition no longer translated into power. Life narrowed to private spaces, managed appearances, and the fragile maintenance of dignity under diminishing circumstances. The world still knew her name, but it no longer needed her presence. When she died in Paris at the end of 2024, the announcement was brief, almost procedural. The cause was ordinary medical indiscriminate. There was no dramatic reckoning, no final reversal, only the quiet cessation of a body that had carried too many projections for too long. The city continued its rituals. The headlines moved on. What remained was the residue of a life lived under permanent observation. Her story lingers because it resists resolution. It does not settle into tragedy or farce, nor does it offer redemption. It exposes a system that confuses visibility with power and adaptation with choice. Jocelyn Wildenstein did not fall from grace so much as outlive the structure that once sustained her. Her life illustrates how dominance can exist without authorship, how wealth can expand freedom while simultaneously eroding selfhood, and how a woman can be endlessly seen yet fundamentally unknown. The haunting question left behind is not what she did to herself, but what was done quietly, systematically, and profitably around her, until there was nothing left to negotiate except the end.